when we talk about who were these original Yajuj and Majuj, if we say they were released during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, but who were they? How did they get into Western Europe? Right? So Imran Hussain, and even if you go back to Ahmed Thompson's book, Dajjal, Original Dajjal, they both have this theory that they could have been the Khazars. The Khazars. The Khazars were a Turkic tribe that lived around the Caucasus region. The Caucasus Mountains are between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Just above Syria and below Turkey, yeah? that region there. Russia and all these countries around it. The Khazars lived there around about the early time of Islam. So they were there during the early caliphates. And they converted into Judaism for political reasons. They actually had Christian power on one side and the Muslims on the other side. And the chief of the Khazars actually decided to become Jewish as a way to... Yes, exactly. So for political reasons he converted to Judaism, and all of the tribe converted to Judaism. And over centuries they gradually moved west into Eastern Europe, and they became known as the Ashkenazi Jews, as opposed to the Sephardic Jews, which were the Jewish communities in Spain. And they eventually moved more and more west into Germany, Britain, France, and into European society. A lot of them became the bankers, the Rothschilds, or probably descended from Ashkenazi Jews, and so on. So this is a theory, that these are the Yajuj and Majuj. They were trapped. There must have been some sort of wall in the Caucasus mountain region, which they were trapped behind. And then during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, they were released. And then that's the rest of it, is how they then infiltrated into Europe. They became part of European society, and so on. To me, that didn't quite make sense, because if you read the history of the Khazars, plus also they were there before the Prophet ﷺ, but there was no, even if there was a barrier in the Caucasus, they could easily move the other way, So you can't be trapped. Unless they were trapped in, I don't know, some sort of, it just didn't seem to add up completely. Although it was an interesting theory. But for me, that wasn't quite making sense. Because they also had relations with other people as well. Anyway, so then one day I was reading this book, Christopher Walker, in one of the reading from our history course. And Christopher Walker, when he was in the chapter about the Crusades, I came across this particular passage. And I've highlighted some bits there. But he was talking about why did the Western Europeans suddenly become obsessed with Jerusalem and the Crusades? Because he recognized this was a strange thing, For nearly 300 years, the whole of Western Europe, they were completely obsessed about doing these crusades and going to Jerusalem, which was really a bit bizarre, And before that, they had been doing peaceful pilgrimage to Jerusalem for a long time. And there is that, obviously sometimes people mention this thing about a certain caliph who was, but that was a very short thing, and historians don't really buy that anymore. That for centuries, that one little incident could have, So he says, there were certain factors that led to the Crusades at that time in Western Europe. And one of the major factors was the coming of these people, the Normans. Right? So he literally says a number of elements changed the attitude in Western Europe from peaceful pilgrimage to violent conquest of the Holy Land. The first was the coming of the Normans.
So the French.
The Normans. They were French people. These people, originally from Scandinavia, had within 2 generations remodeled itself as a dominant force within the society of Europe. So these are people that have come into Europe, originally from Scandinavia. They have become a dominant force within the society of Europe. And these people are very assertive, dictatorial, militant, controlling, sometimes content to act as mercenaries. In other words, if they can't get control for themselves, they'll be happy to be mercenaries for someone else. But they're very militant, you know. They liked social hierarchies. They're not, you know, they liked having, slaves and all these things. If they could not be dominant, they would submit, but they would always want to be engaged in warfare. Wherever necessary, they would get the blessing of the Pope. But where necessary, they didn't care if they were excommunicated. In other words, if it suits them, their military purpose, they would, get the blessings of the Pope. But if the Pope is not going along with their plans, there would be, forget that. So, in other words, they were not deeply religious believers. They were using faith, according to their own ends of power. The Pope gives William the Conqueror his blessing to invade Britain, because in return William the Conqueror recognizes him as the Pope. So for the Pope, this is also good. So that type of thing, they were using each other. So this, what historians describe as a symbiosis between the Normans and the papacy. And the invasion of England, William the Conqueror had a flag with a red cross, the same flag that was used in the Crusades. And how they described the capture of Jerusalem, in brackets, the event preferable to all events. The capture of Jerusalem, the event preferable to all events. So like this obsession with Jerusalem, right? I was thinking back what Sheikh Ridhwan was saying this mysterious obsession with Jerusalem. So when I read this, I started thinking the Normans, right? What's going on here? Who are the Normans? Could it be something there, that these Normans are the factor that then suddenly makes Europe obsessed with Jerusalem? So I decided to find out a bit about the Normans. I started reading, they were descended from Vikings who settled in Normandy. So I said, let me find out more about the Vikings. Where did they come from? Who are they? So the Viking Age started in 795. The very first Viking attack was in Lindisfarne, an island, very small island off the northeast coast of Britain, where the first Viking ships came. They looted the monastery, killed all the monks, stole all the silver, and took the ships back to Norway or Sweden, wherever they came from. So this is 793, the beginning of the Viking Age in Europe. The Prophet ﷺ died in 632. So I was thinking, okay, there could be a connection. If we're saying the barrier was destroyed during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, somewhere around about 630 or so, 620s or 630. These Vikings then suddenly start coming and invading around 793. The timing could possibly make sense. The Viking hordes poured out of Scandinavia. So Scandinavia is Norway, Sweden, Denmark. That is called Scandinavia. They raided, settled, colonized, penetrated and assimilated into European and Russia as well. The Russians are descended from the Vikings as well. They were known to the Muslims as the Rus. So that was also making sense as well. Then Gog and Magog, Britain, Russia, they all descended from Vikings. For almost 300 years, these Vikings were pouring out into Western Europe and into Russia. 300 years is a long time. We're talking 9 generations of people living their whole lives and dying during this time. It's a long time. 9 generations of Muslims, Europeans lived with Vikings just pouring and invading. So at this point I was getting a bit interested in this theory. So I'd run out of what Google could give me, so I had to go to a serious library. At that time I was doing my Masters in UCL. So I thought, let me go and do some serious reading about the Vikings and what we know about their, do we know anything about their earlier history around the time of the Prophet and what was, is this a conceivable thing? So I got myself a latte. I think it's time for all of us to have a latte now, and we'll come back inshallah after the break. So where I went into the library. So first of all, looking at when did the Vikings come? Are we going to find a correlation between the life of the Prophet, if we're saying that's when the barrier was destroyed? So I started reading about the Vikings. Where did they come from? When did they come? And it turned out that the historians, they were saying it's a great mystery. Why did these Vikings suddenly start pouring out of Scandinavia at that particular point in history? It's an unsolved mystery that historians have. They've looked at different theories, like, was it population pressure? Was it because they suddenly got technology to build these ships that they were coming out? But none of those is backed up by the historical evidence. So, according to this professor, for example, he said, it's one of the genuine great mysteries about this period. Why did these Vikings suddenly start coming out of their homeland in the huge numbers? And for 3 centuries, remember, 300 years, 9 generations, they were continuing to come out. Genuine great mystery means they haven't got a solution to that problem. According to another historian, the references are there for you. Never before or since has such a thing happened from Scandinavia, right? They were moving from Limerick in the west to the Volga in the east. So from Ireland to Russia, from Greenland to Spain. They were going around as pirates, traders, extortioners, mercenaries, conquerors, rulers, warlords, emigrating farmers. There was a massive pouring out of people in the thousands and thousands that went on for all these generations. But what were the causes of this immense wave? Question mark. The question is not answered. So this was making me think, wow, there's something going on here, Why did the Vikings pour out? These are quotes, not my words here, this is a quote from. According to another historian, he said we need a special explanation. We can't find any normal historical phenomena that explain this massive flood of people from these countries. So this was making me feel even more intrigued, that they're saying there's no explanation. Where did they come from? How did they suddenly come out in these massive numbers? Farrell, another historian, he actually said, we can never hope to understand this and the causes. In other words, historians have thought, and they've given up. We're never going to be able to get to the bottom of this mystery. So, according to our theory, the barrier was destroyed during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. So my next mission was to find out what was happening in Scandinavia during the period of the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, especially the Medinan period, which is basically you're talking about 622 to 632. Obviously you're not going to find that, but you're looking at the 7th century, right? 7th century. If we can find out the history of the 7th century of Scandinavia, that might help us to get to the bottom of what was going on. However, this is when I found out that the Vikings had no written records. They were barbarians, remember? They were barbarians. They had no reading or they had these things called runes. which were inscriptions, and that's the only stuff we have. These runes, they're like symbols, but they didn't have like extensive literature, writing, historical accounts and things like that. So we're actually going into prehistory, because that's the definition of prehistory, is where the written records end, and then you're relying upon archaeological evidence, right? So when we're talking about that 7th century, because the Vikings, they only started writing down proper literature about 200 years after they came out into Europe. So they wrote these famous sagas. You might have heard of the sagas, especially in Iceland and places like that. The Viking sagas. And they were the stories of their heroes and conquests and things like that. But they were written about 200 years after the first Vikings came out into Europe. So when we're looking at the 7th century, you're basically looking at archaeological evidence to try to find out what was happening in Norway, Sweden during that time. So, what do we know for sure? The first human beings went to that region about 10,000 years ago. We know that this is for sure because before 10,000 years ago, it was the Ice Age. And there was complete ice there. There was no way anyone could live there. About 10,000 years ago, the ice started melting. Now, one of the anthropologists who studies the archaeological findings, I read in one of her books, really interesting about the 7th century Scandinavia. This is what she said. Her name is Jesh. She said, if we look at the archaeological evidence, what we find in the 7th century is something dramatic happening in Scandinavia. She calls it the change. Right? Something major happened in that 7th century in Scandinavia. So she describes how the society was before the change and how it was after the change. And the change happened in that round about that time. They can't precise, but it's around that 7th century when the Prophet ﷺ. So obviously this was, I was thinking, subhanAllah, this is crazy, But previous to the change, she said, the Scandinavian farming societies, they lived and farmed peacefully with an economic system based on redistribution. That means based on sort of distributing amongst the community, right? So it's not greed, everyone just takes for themselves. They share, it's like a communal system, right? You could say more like a socialist type of system of farming. But then, she says, suddenly, this extensive farming system was abandoned. And the cultural landscape slowly changed. When the previous farming economy collapsed, a large number of families left their homes. What happened to them and their animals? Question mark, she says. All we know is that in many regions the farms were never rebuilt and the people never returned to their homeland and ancestral graves. So in other words, this is my words now. This same time when the Prophet ﷺ is saying that the barrier has been breached, there's something happening in northern Scandinavia, where the Vikings come from. The old peaceful farming society has been replaced. They've been, their homes, they've been chased out of their homes, etc. And a different landscape is emerging on the Scandinavian peninsula. So what was the difference? The new landscape around about, she says, emerged around 700, was different. The houses were smaller. The buyer had room for fewer animals, and only special people were buried under mounds. Remember about the Normans? They love hierarchy. So previously everyone was buried. In this new system, only special people, the hierarchy, are given the honor of being buried. An intensified agriculture has taken the place of the former system. Intensified meaning what? When you're trying to get the maximum out of the land, right? So in other words, they want more. It's more towards profit generation. Fewer animals were kept and stored through the winter. New families come into power. Emergence of memorial forms and a stratum of landholders who strive to acquire as much land as possible. So these are different type of people. These people are people who want to acquire more and more land. They want to acquire more and more land. In short, a new economic and political system has been established at precisely that time when the Prophet ﷺ says that Ya'juj and Ma'juj have been released. Or he didn't say they've been released, let me be accurate. He said the barrier has been breached. So for me now, I was thinking, wow, okay, so that all fits together. This will be explained that these new people have suddenly come upon Norway and Sweden, and then 100 years later they're now pouring out into Europe. So the timing fits in. The timing fits in for the Vikings to be the Gog and Magog. Now what about the location? Where's the barrier? Before Islam, there was a tradition amongst the Jews and Christians that Alexander the Great was Dhul Qarnayn. Because remember, Dhul Qarnayn was given power over the east and the west. And Alexander the Great, the Greek emperor, had been given a massive dominion from east to west, from India all the way to Egypt. So Jews and Christians often believed that Alexander the Great was Dhul Qarnayn and that he had built a barrier somewhere in the Caucasus region. So this is where the Muslims took this from, this idea that Alexander the Great was Dhul Qarnayn. And until today, if you read the tafsirs, some of them often mention that Dhul Qarnayn was Alexander. How do you say it in Arabic again? Al-Iskandar. That's it, Al-Iskandar. However, now that we know a lot more about Alexander, we know that he was a polytheist. He was an idol worshipper. He claimed to be the son of Zeus and all these sort of things. So for me, that immediately means that the Quran describes him either as a prophet or a righteous man, a believer. Anyway, so that was just to show, just to let you know that I'm aware of the Alexander issue. There was an Abbasid caliph actually sent an expedition of scholars to try to find the barrier around the Caucasus because of this information from the Jewish and Christian tradition. The Quran tells us that the Dhul Qarnayn went to the setting place of the sun, Maghrib al-Shams, and then he went to Matli al-Shams, the east. And then he went another direction, but the third direction is not told. But in the tafsir, they say the third direction was north. If you look at tafsir of Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi under Surah Al-Kahf, you see he just says he went north. The third direction was north. From previous, in the Quran says he went to the setting of the sun and the rising of the sun. In other words, to the furthest west and the furthest east. So it would make sense the third time he goes to the furthest north. The furthest north. And this is also why I didn't agree with the theory about the Caucasus, because they're not the furthest north in the world. Now Sheikh Imran, he says that Dhul Qarnayn was given world rule. He was a world ruler, one of those rare people in history that Allah gave complete dominion over the world. And part of the divine wisdom of that is because this is why he's linked to Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Because Ya'juj and Ma'juj are also given world order, but their world order is a tyrannical world order. It's an atheist world order. Dhul Qarnayn is given a world order, but it's a righteous world order. It's a world order based on belief and justice. So that's why the two are linked. And that's why Allah has also given him world order or world rule. that sort of makes sense. If we were to read the Quran, he went to the furthest rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, right? Indicating he went as far as you can go. The interesting thing is, around about 9 or 10,000 years ago, we were talking about, remember, when it has to be after that time according to my theory, the continents were joined. And the Americas had not separated completely from Eurasia 10,000 years ago. There was still a bridge, land bridge. So if you went west, you would actually go into the Americas at that time. Anyway, so from this, if we accept Sheikh Imran's thing that he was given a world rule, and even most of the commentators, that's why they believe he was either Alexander or Cyrus, because these were great world emperors. But if he was literally given world rule, the thing about the Caucasus then wouldn't really make sense. And when he went to the west, Sheikh Imran says he went to the Black Sea, and when he went east, he went to the Caspian Sea. And then when he went north, he went to the Caucasus, but that's all within a small region. So how does that then mean that he had world rule? For me, that doesn't make sense. Anyway, so what would make sense is if he went to Norway, because that is the furthest north point that people are living. It turns out that Norway is the furthest northern land that allows human habitation, meaning that other countries that are on the same level of northerly latitude, they're frozen over. You can't survive there, like Siberia, Alaska. Only like Eskimos and people like that can live. But Norway is on that same degree of latitude. The reason why people can live in Norway is because of this thing called the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a current around the ocean that actually warms up the land of Norway, so it's not completely frozen over. So Norway is literally the most northern land in the world that people can live as a normal, sort of semi-normal way. So, and now the next point is that there's massive mountains all the way along Norway. The whole country is a massive chain of mountains. So if we're looking for mountain barriers, there was plenty of mountains there. The mountain range is called the Kjol, which runs all the way from the south of the country all the way up to the north. And it made vast areas of eastern and western Scandinavia almost inaccessible to each other throughout the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages is when the Vikings are already out. So it was those mountains are almost, there's very few places you can cross those mountains. One of the reasons is because, remember we talked about the northerly latitude. The Gulf Stream warms up the climate. But as soon as you start climbing up the mountains, you lose that warming effect of the Gulf Stream. So those mountains become extremely, extremely frozen and cold. So it makes them even more difficult to cross over. So other archaeological evidence, they said Scandinavia has been inhabited by two distinct groups of people from the earliest times. So this is going back right to the prehistory, the real archaeology of even before Prophet ﷺ time. What are they digging up, It seems like on the other side of the mountains is a different type of people to this side of the mountain. Okay, they call it the Komsa culture and the Fomsa culture. This is simply from archaeological remains. Seem like they're completely different type of people on that side of the mountains and those on this side of the mountains. The Viking chieftain Thor, he said that he was from further north than all the Northmen, i.e. from the land beyond the mountains. So a lot of the early Viking chiefs, or the early Vikings, they came from the land on the other side of the mountains, on the other side of the Norwegian coast. Another quote there from Offa. He lived furthest north of all the Norwegians. He lived north of the country alongside the Norwegian Sea. He said that though the land extended a very long way north from there, but all of it is uninhabited, except in a few places there are a few Lapps. The Lapps are the Sami people. These are sort of, they live in the proper Arctic snow. The Bible mentions that Gog and Magog will come from the far north, right? In Ezekiel, a leader from the far north. So the Bible says that again and again, they'll come from the north. The Bible says, you will come from your place in the far north. The Hebrew word means the uttermost part of the north. When the Vikings first started raiding Britain, many people believed that they were Gog and Magog that were prophesied in the Bible. This is a map of the world by Idrisi, a Muslim scholar of the 12th century. Al-Idrisi actually drew this map for a Norman king. Yeah, the Normans invaded Sicily. I think it was Robert, wasn't it? Robert. So the Normans came across the Muslims very early on in Sicily, and they were very much taking on the scholars and supporting the scholars. So Al-Idrisi drew this map of the world. But you can see he's put Yajuj and Majuj up there as well. And if you look at the map, obviously it's a slightly odd map because it's the knowledge of the time, but you can see Europe here. This is Europe, isn't it? You've got Spain, you've got Italy, you've got Greece. Britain's probably somewhere here, but it's not. He doesn't care about Britain in one of these times. So far, what have we found? The timing fits. The location fits furthest north. There's plenty of mountains up there, right? So all of these things that we know about Yajuj and Majuj are fitting together. You can imagine some sort of barrier up there in those Norwegian mountains that just blocked off these people, because on the other side all they had was the Arctic Ocean. There was no way they could go because they wouldn't have had the ships. Right? They only learned how to make the ships later when the barrier was destroyed. Then they built the ships, then they start coming and start invading all of Europe. Language. Because the Quran says, remember the Quran says, when he came to these people next to the mountain, they could barely understand a word. They could barely understand a word. What does that mean? First of all, we don't know who the Quran is describing. Is it talking about the Yajuj and Majuj? Or is it talking about the people that asked Dhul-Qarnayn to help them? You know, it's not clear. Yeah, it was in the Quran. It says he found on the one side of the mountain, a people who could not understand or barely understand a word. They said, is it the same people or is it the other people? O Dhul-Qarnayn, inna Yajuj wa Majuj mufsiduna fil ard. Can you build a barrier for us? Just an interesting thing was that the Viking language, Old Norse, is, according to scholars, almost incomprehensible tongue. Just a reminder from the history course, right? Normans, how they spread throughout Europe, right? We know about Britain, but don't forget also Italy, Sicily. Here we talked about that was a Muslim country. In fact, you know, the first Muslim land ever to be taken by non-Muslims and kept was Sicily. But they spread throughout Western Europe, infiltrated into the aristocracy, infiltrated into the hierarchy. So what I'm implying is that gradually the Normans, who are the descendant of Vikings, they gradually replace most of the aristocracy of Europe. Britain is an easy one, yeah? We know 1066 the Normans completely wiped away the previous rulers of Britain. The Anglo-Saxons were either killed or reduced to serfdom, and all of the land was given to Norman lords. But what about the Franks? What about the French, who were the people of Charlemagne? what happened to them? Remember, if you remember, the Franks were the tribe that settled in modern day France and Germany. Right? Now, when the Vikings first come, Charlemagne fought against them. Yeah, because he was a powerful emperor. But after Charlemagne's time, the resistance of the French became very much weakened. And the Vikings were able to go right into France, into Paris and the other cities. As we know, they set up a major colony in Normandy, which became the land of the Normans. But if you look at the actual French monarchy, the Charlemagne's family were known as the Carolingians, right? The Carolingians. In 987, the Carolingian dynasty comes to an end, and a new king comes in place, Hugh Capet, or Capet, I don't know. And he's the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, which goes on for many generations to be the kings of France. So I was interested to find out who's Hugh Capet. Where does he come from? It turns out he comes from obscure origins. Right? Obscure origins. Now this is normally, being from an obscure origin normally means you don't come from established aristocracy. You know, you're a new person that's has been trying to come in. So his paternal family are the Robertians. If you trace them back, the only furthest you can go is up to his grandfather, I believe. From his grandfather, it disappears. No one knows where these people have come from. So this is a typical Viking Norman pattern. You know, when they've come into European lands, they've infiltrated, they've fought their way to the top, but their ancestry is obscured, right? And sometimes they even try to claim ancestry from other established people within European society. A great example is the Normans in Britain. The Normans, at first, for several generations, they ruled Britain as French rulers. They spoke French, they despised the English, and the English despised them and hated them. You know, Norman was like a brutal, the English call them orca. This is where the orcs come from in what's his name? Yeah, Tolkien. The word orc, they were so feared and they were so brutal and ruthless upon wherever they conquered. Similar reputation like the Vikings have, obviously, as well. So when these people tended to then infiltrate into the aristocracy or get into positions of power, often it's an embarrassment, you know. Where's your family? Where have you come from? Who are you, King Hugh Capet? You know, you need some sort of heritage. So often they would. So the Normans are a classic example. The Normans, they were descended from Vikings, but they soon stopped referring to themselves with their Viking traditions, and they took on the French titles like Duke and other titles of French nobility. They started speaking the French language, right? So they could get some respectability. So there's a possibility here that this, you know, France is also now, I'm not saying this is, because no one knows where this guy came from, what's his ancestry, but it's possible that he was from Viking descent. And then if you look at Germany, the third main region, so you have Britain, France and Germany, right? They're the three main regions really of Western civilization. Germany, we know, was composed of hundreds of small fiefdoms, dukedoms, princedoms. So this was the ideal ground where Viking and Norman type of elements could come in and seize power and make their way up as well. So we're going to just look at now, to finish off, some of the attributes of the Yajuj and Majuj, and do they fit into the attributes of what our theory is, that this is European / Western civilization, do the attributes that I mentioned fit in? So what does the Quran tell us? The biggest attribute the Quran gives us is that they're mufsidun fil ard. These Yajuj and Majuj, Ya Dhal Qarnayn, inna Yajuj wa Majuj mufsiduna fil ard. These Gog and Magog, they are mufsidun, they're corrupting, they're destroying the earth. The word mufsid is from the grammatical form of ism fa'il. Those people who study Arabic will know that this usually refers to something which is an abiding characteristic. It's not something that is tied to time, a temporary. Ism fa'il, we give it to something that is not temporary, but that is their abiding characteristic. There's a lot of descriptions about the Vikings and then even the Normans, as I say, that they were extremely destructive and brutal people. This is a quote from one Englishman when the Viking invasions were taking place in Britain. What is ifsad, mufsidun? There are people who create ifsad. Ifsad is from the fourth form of fasad. You've heard of fasad, even in Urdu we have that word fasad. Right? Ifsad means to cause fasad. Now, this is mentioned in other places in the Quran as well. So, for example, when Allah said to the angels, surely I am making a Khalifa on the earth, what did they say? They said, are you going to create someone who will cause fasad? Yufsidu fil ard wa yasfiku dima. Someone who will cause fasad and bloodshed. This was the question that the Malaika asked Allah. Why they couldn't understand why Allah is creating a Khalifa, but this Khalifa is going to cause fasad and bloodshed. Another ayah of Quran mentions, when it is said to them, do not cause corruption in the earth, they say, we're not causing corruption, we're putting things right. Surely they are the ones who are causing corruption, but they do not, they themselves may not perceive that they are the corruptors. Therefore, we can say that ifsad is something that human beings do, not just Yajuj and Majuj. Right? Because the Malaika said that human beings are going to, this is a general characteristic of human beings that don't follow divine guidance. They will become mufsidun. It's not just for Yajuj and Majuj. So what we can say is that Yajuj and Majuj will be the extreme manifestation of this general human tendency. So all human beings that do not follow divine guidance will cause ifsad. But the Yajuj and Majuj are like the extreme that will come at the end of time. And so when we look at the Western civilization, we see that they have some extreme characteristics in this regard. For example, the abandoning of religion altogether. This may be something unique to Western civilization, to become complete atheist. Yes, there have been, for example, you might be thinking about the Greek philosophers. Some of the Greek philosophers were atheists, although the mainstream Greek philosophers did believe in a supreme being. There were some philosophers that did go into atheism, but the Greek people were never atheists. You understand? So this may be uniquely the first people as a society, civilization, that have abandoned belief in God altogether. So with the abandonment of religion altogether, there's absolutely no moral imperative. You've got no reason to follow any moral teaching, except if you choose to yourself. Right? Because there's no consequences, there's no belief in an afterlife, there's no belief in any type of accountability. Just a side note, fasad is different to fitna. Dajjal, remember, was mentioned, Asharru fitnatin yuntadhar. Dajjal is the worst fitna that is expected. It's a little bit different to fasad. Fitna contains the meaning of temptation. So often, say for example, a very beautiful woman may be described as fattana in books of fiqh and things like that, because it's within the fitna. In other words, the dunyawi temptation will be, Dajjal will bring the materialistic temptations that would attract you. A further explanation, more precise explanation of what is ifsad is in Surah Al-Baqarah 205, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِذَا تَوَلَّى سَعَى فِي الْأَرْضِ لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا وَيُهْلِكُ الْحَرْثَ وَالنَّسْلَ. Allah says this person who turns away from divine guidance, he then goes around the earth, sa'a fil ard, like he's actually exerting effort around the earth to corrupt the earth. And he destroys agriculture and livestock. So here, ifsad is linked to destruction of the land, the productivity of the land, the agriculture of the land, and livestock. So, in other words, these people, they don't use the earth sustainably. They don't follow those traditional forms of agriculture where, you look after the earth at the same time the earth looks after you. These mufsidun, they destroy the earth, they drain it of its resources. So this is why, for me, looking back to that 7th century description of Scandinavia, how this change took place to this new system of farming that was intensive farming. You're draining the earth, And these people who wanted to acquire as much land as possible. This for me could be the birth of capitalism. Right? So this is what capitalism is. To drain and make profit, and not think about the consequences, the destruction of the earth and the environment. That in a nutshell is capitalism, and you can see the roots of that in these Vikings. So then the Vikings, they start invading all of these lands from Britain to Normandy to Russia. In the Middle Ages we have then the Norman kingdoms, so the Vikings and then the Normans. This is then when we see a new system appearing in Europe, serfdom, what's known as the feudalism. Feudalism starts at this time after the Vikings and the Normans come in the scene. In other words, the vast majority of people in Europe are made into serfs, which is virtual slavery. Talking about probably 90-95% of the population. Yeah? They now have these lords that live in these castles, and they have these armored knights, and they're subjugating the population. They've reduced them into serfdom. And then, because previous to that, in Europe, the peasants, the common people, they had a lot of freedoms. They had these common lands. They were known as commons. Forests, rivers. These were places that everyone was free to go and hunt, to get fish from the rivers. Slowly things start changing. Now with feudalism, we see that these new lords, these new landlords, they're very obsessed about getting more and more profit out of the land. So they realize that as long as we let the peasants, the serfs, have their freedom to fish and run around in the forests, they're not going to be that motivated to be growing the crops. So they actually then start stopping that. They start taking the forests, taking over the forests and the rivers, privatizing them. Why? Because they want the serfs to produce more crops so they can get more profits. So you can see what's happening, it's a whole process that's taking place of enslavement of people and draining of resources for profits. In Europe, we see for the first time the whole concept of privatization of land. You know, people start building fences around land. This is my land now, you can't come onto this land, you can't go up. Remember how she said in the 7th century, that change in Scandinavia? A new stratum of landholders that want to acquire as much land as possible. And so we see this now coming throughout Europe. Deforestation of Europe. So before these colonial empires destroyed the rest of the world, they destroyed Europe first actually. Where are all the forests? Britain was a land of forests. You know, now if you fly in the helicopter, you see old fields, don't you? Not many forests left. So these lands were actually deforested first, so that people could get more and more land for agriculture, livestock, whatever would make the most money. That's what they wanted. So then the Crusades take place. For almost 300 years we have these Normans, Western Europe. When the Mongols and later on the Ottomans come into the scene, this is where Western Europeans give up the Eastern movement, right? Because first of all the Mongols and then later on the Ottomans are too powerful. They're way too strong, and the Western Europeans are held back. And this is when they start turning towards the West, trying to cross over the Atlantic Ocean and so on. According to the Bible, the Revelations, for 1,000 years, those Satan will be held back. When the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations of the four corners of the earth. Gog and Magog. So the 1,000 years was the Islamic age that was established by the Khulafa Rashidun, by the Prophet ﷺ. This is what was predicted in the Bible, you know, the 1,000 years of the kingdom of God. After that 1,000 years are over, this is when Gog and Magog are released. In the meantime, Muslims are being expelled from Spain. The Western Europeans have started going around Africa to the Far East. They discover the Americas. So this now white European Western civilization has now got the Americas. The Americas are inhabited by first people or native, sort of people that have not got the advanced technology of the Eurasian, Afro-Eurasian people. So these natives are eliminated from the American continent. This description in the Quran, Sheikh Imran Hussein talks about this, that when Dhul Qarnayn came to the east, so Imran Hussein said when he came to the east, these people, they had no shelter from the sun. These were these type of aboriginal people. These people that lived without advanced technology. They lived very close to the earth. So what did Dhul Qarnayn do? When he went to the west and he found those other people, he said, I will punish the wrongdoers and I will reward the good people. But when he went to the east and he found these people, the aboriginal type of people, the Quran just says, كَذَلِكَ وَقَدْ أَحَطْنَا بِمَا لَدَيْهِ خُبْرًا. The Quran just says one word, it says كَذَلِكَ, like that. Like that. So what Imran Hussein says, and this is an interpretation, it's not from Tafsir or anything like that, he says what it means is that Dhul Qarnayn left them in their state. He didn't interfere with them. Because these are people that are sort of the people that live very close to nature. You know, they're so involved in nature. The trees have meaning for them. Every tree has a separate identity for them. The animals have sacred meaning for them. You know, and most of these people, if you look at them, they believe in a creator. They believe in God as well. So he says, Dhul Qarnayn just left them. You don't interfere with them. You don't do anything to them. And so once again, the contrast, when the Western You know, so Dhul Qarnayn left them in peace. The Western civilization, when they come to them, what do? They kill them. They destroy them. They say these are inferior people. They're pagans. They don't believe in Christianity or this or that, the other. We need to bring them civilization. They wipe them out. In Muhammad Ali's funeral, Muhammad Ali rahimahullah, who died, if you remember, Imam Zaid Shakir was the actual chairing the thing. But Muhammad Ali had actually planned the funeral, you know, who's going to come and speak, how long they speak for. He had in detail prescribed what exactly is going to happen after he dies, you know, in that thing. And it was broadcast all over the world, remember, everyone was watching it all over the world. And very interestingly, he had a Native American chief there. You know, this chief, he said I found a really beautiful thing.
Now, this great darkness that has happened to us, you must understand that he who had gathered us here, that his road is straight. Peacefully, he will arrive at his land. Sungwaya Disae, our Creator. It is the same as you call him, Allah.
I thought that was profound. Actually, our Creator is the same as you call him, Allah. So this is the thing, you know. They went and they killed off these people. They start this transatlantic slave trade where millions of slaves are brought from West Africa to work in the Americas. So, like we said, we're not saying this is a human tendency, if sad, but you can see there's an extremeness here, you know, there's an extremeness. All in search of materialism, all in search of profits, a complete, destruction of people, not giving any regard to human beings, you know, in the interest of making that more and more money, really, that's all it is. They want to set up these big plantations so they can make a lot of money from cash crops, intensive agriculture. So the type of agriculture they carried out in the Americas and the Caribbean was horrific. Even worse than what they done in Europe, because in Europe, they live in Europe. They need to preserve the land to some extent. When they're in the Americas and the Caribbean, they so exhausted the land growing these, coffee and tobacco and these things, that once that land was dead, they had to move to other land, and that would take generations for that land to revive. They completely killed the land, vast areas of land. They were buying the cattle because they could make a lot of money from beef, right? Deforestation, eliminating the buffalo. All of this stuff was going on. And then eventually North America and Australia, these continents are also privatized. The land grabbing, the fencing. The people before had lived in communal land. There was no private land in the native American or Australian systems. And of course we know about the slaves, so Muhammad Ali is a black man in America. How did the black people get to America? They weren't coming over there, in a nice peaceful manner. They were brought there as slaves, right? Colonialism, the 18th and 19th centuries, where we now have these European countries colonizing all around the world. So eventually by the 19th century, even the Muslim world is slowly subjugated. China is subjugated through the Opium Wars. and then finally there's a scramble for Africa. So, for the first time, as far as we know, there's a complete world order. The British, the sun never sets on the British Empire. It becomes a complete global empire for the first time that we know of. These are just other examples of the ifsad, we talked about in the history course, how the Opium Wars, the British selling opium to the Chinese, approximately 80 million, 90 million Chinese addicted to opium by the end of that. Once again, all in the name of trade and making profits. India, before the British went into India was was the most prosperous country in the whole world. I think something like between 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's wealth was generated in India before the British went in there. When the British left after a couple of hundred years, the production of India had gone down to 4% of the world GDP. So massive destruction of Indian industry led to famines in India. In those famines, millions and millions of people died, and the British stood back and wouldn't feed those people. Eventually, by the time of the 19th century, the serfdom is coming to an end in Europe, and slowly slavery is also abolished. And this is done because the economic situation no longer requires serfs on the land. You no longer require slaves. It becomes much more economically viable to have people working for peanut wages, because they're more motivated and you don't get rebellions. Anyway, so you have this colonization of 3 continents, subjugation of Asia, scramble for Africa. The British Empire splits into 2. So you get the Eastern British Empire, and you have the Western British Empire, which is called the United States of America. Very similar to how the Roman Empire split into East and West. And the United States of America rapidly expands to the whole of North America. So yeah, this is the nature of the Vikings. Once again, this extremeness, this extreme ifsad, So how they were described by early people when they first started coming into France. The cleric Dudo, he wrote, "These people who insolently abandon themselves to excessive indulgence, live in outrageous union with many women, and therein shameless and unlawful intercourse breed innumerable progeny." So these were people who had multiple partners. They were having, unlawful intercourse, meaning they weren't sticking towards marriage and things like that. Once they have grown up, the young quarrel violently with their fathers and grandfathers or with each other about property. This was something I found interesting because, when the young grow up, they fight against their own fathers and grandfathers over property and wealth. So this was something I found quite unusual, because most societies, you have a lot of respect for elders within the society. Especially your own father or grandfather. If you look at all these other, that are supposedly barbarian, the Mongols or the Huns, or in history, look at their, how did they treat their elders or their parents? This is very, very different. Describing the immense number of these Vikings that were coming out into Europe. Ibn Fadlan was a Muslim scholar. He was sent by the Abbasid Caliph to some expedition, but he was a scholar and he was writing scientific notes upon his journeys. And interestingly, he met a group of what were called Northmen, or Vikings. And this is one of even with Western historians, this is one of the best accurate and contemporary records of describing these people, the Vikings, that they have in historical documents. So what did Ibn Fadlan, how did he describe in them? when you read his description, you may think that actually he's exaggerating because it's so bad. But what historians have found is that his descriptions are actually accurate according to archaeological evidence that they found later. So when he describes the funeral of one of the Viking chiefs, you think, that can't be true. No people could be so barbaric. No people could be so degenerated, you know. And initially when people found his account, they thought he must be exaggerating, you know, it can't be true. But they've actually found other evidence now to prove that the account he gave was very accurate. So then we can assume that the rest of his descriptions are also accurate. And we know that anyway from the Muslim perspective, our scholars were very concerned of making accurate recordings of things, not of exaggerating and so on. So what does Ibn Fadlan say about the Vikings that he met? He said they are the filthiest of Allah's creatures. They do not wash after defecating or urinating, nor after sexual intercourse. And they do not wash after eating. They are like wayward donkeys. And they made no attempt to seek privacy when they have intercourse with their female slaves. In other words, they do it in public. This is very, very unusual. Very, very unusual for human beings. You know, to just have intimate relations with the opposite sex and you're doing it in front of other people. Right? This is bizarre. So Ibn Fadlan said a man will have sexual intercourse with his slave girl while his companion looks on. Sometimes whole groups will come together in this fashion, each in the presence of others. These are some of the things we can draw out about the Vikings. Having public relations in public. No respect for elders. So put question marks there. Is this the beginning of individualism in Western societies? Is this the beginning of capitalism? Is this the beginning of atheism? Because we've seen how the Normans, they were using the church, but they were not afraid to be excommunicated from the church. And is this also the beginnings of racism and hierarchy, which became such a feature of Western civilization during the colonial period? By the end of the 19th century, Western civilization was basically abandoning religion altogether. Nietzsche was able to say that religion is finished. Social scientists were describing this as the transition from metaphysical to what they called positivism, which basically meant going from belief in a God to atheism. Individualism we've talked about before as well. This is something that now anthropologists that study Western civilization are studying. Why is it that Western civilization has developed this individualism that is rarely found in other societies, but now is becoming globalized through the spread of Western culture around the world? So individualism is this idea of putting the self at the center of everything, rather than relations, social relations. The self is more important than the relations. So you see this again and again. I mean, this is just being brainwashed into our children whenever they watch anything on TV. They are being given individualism. Capitalism, is this where we see the earliest beginnings of capitalism? This endless accumulation of profit and capital. Vikings were famous for their hoards of treasure. They buried them. They just, why are you burying a hoard of treasure? What are you going to do with that? It's not being used, put to any use. Yeah, they want more. They want to accumulate, and keep that. These people had a lot of energy. Sa'a fil ardi liyufsida fiha. This person, he puts a lot of energy into going around the earth creating facade. The Quran says that Sa'a fil ard. Sa'i, when we go Safa and Marwa, that's called Sa'i. It's hard work. So these people are hard at work with this, what they're doing. They're not lying around. These Normans were serious people. They were full of energy and vigor. They were working hard for their wealth and their status and everything. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to reduce it to a 4-day working week. The British people don't want that. They want to work hard in their thing, you know. The beliefs, the atheism, if you look at Viking beliefs, very odd, you know. Like I remember I said, even like these primitive people, they believe in a creator. The Vikings are very odd, if you look at their early beliefs. They don't really have a concept of a creator God, even amongst their paganism. Normally, even pagans have some sort of creator. Look at their beliefs, read up about them, you know. There's no creator God. They basically, they believe, but maybe that explains why this then went full circle after going into Christianity and Catholicism. They eventually end up back on atheism, you know. Because atheism is one of the most, you could say one of the most stupidest positions. You know, it indicates a real lack of intellect to become an atheist. So that's why I wonder if that you know, when they said, Allah said, we found a people that could barely understand a word. You know, is it referring to that type of really like, they're a bit, you know, they're not quite got it, you know, they don't quite understand. And then finally, the wars of Gog and Magog. Wars of Gog and Magog. We're going back now to the book I mentioned earlier, Imam Anwar Shah Kashmiri, rahimahullah, in his commentary of Sahih al-Bukhari, where he mentions about Gog and Magog already have been released during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. He also mentions in there a lot of other stuff. The world will remain after 4,291 years. The world will remain orphaned, and the wars of Gog and Magog will rage therein. And the rest of the days will be the days of the Masih. The days of the Masih, according to Jewish chroniclers, are the days of the seal of prophets. And the world will be left orphaned after him without any guide, i.e. prophecy would end. After that, and following much good that would follow the last prophet, would come the bloodsheds of Gog and Magog. That is when Jesus would descend. So in other words, after the Prophet ﷺ, you have a period where you have those who follow his guidance. You know? And that was 1,000 years, as we've seen in other places. But after that is when you have the bloodsheds of Gog and Magog. Bloodsheds, right? And eventually, this is when Isa alayhi salam will come back during that end of that period. It is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, this is Imam Anwar Shah quoting, that they will emerge against the children of Israel. They will come from the furthest northwest as many nations. None but Allah knows their number, and cause corruption and destruction, and they will seek Jerusalem. And this is actually, he died in 1932. So this is before the Jewish state is, but you know, he may have seen the beginning of the British occupation of Jerusalem. It is mentioned in the prophetic hadith that they will head for Jerusalem, but this is not directly linked to the collapse of the barrier, because he keeps trying to argue, look, it doesn't mean the barrier will be destroyed then. The barrier has already been destroyed in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is something that will happen much later. So if we go back to the Quran, let's remind ourselves, I think I already mentioned this. What does Allah say when He will destroy the barrier? When Allah destroys the barrier, just one short statement. On that day we shall leave some of them to surge against others of them. تَرَكْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَمُوجُ فِي بَعْضٍ. Remember we talked about Yamuj, like a moj, like a wave. There will be, literally, there will always be warring against each other. So after the 1,000 years of the guidance that comes to the Prophet ﷺ, that's when the time of Gog and Magog come. The Vikings were in constant battle against each other. The way that they would fight is, you know, if you read the descriptions in one of the books I read, when two groups of Vikings wanted to fight each other, they would go out one on one boat and one on another boat, right? One group on a boat and another group on a boat, and they would meet in the sea or the river in the middle, and they would be just chopping each other across, from one boat until one is completely destroyed and the other one survives. Which is a very brutal way to fight if you think about it, because you can't run. You're in the middle of a sea or a river, two boats next to each other. You just have to, just fighting and hacking each other across the thing until one is completely finished, One of the most common things we see in the hadith about the signs of the last time. Remember, al-harj. The Prophet keeps coming again and again in the hadith about signs of the last day. Bloodshed. So this is one of the major signs, that these Yajuj and Majuj. This was the thing that I found interesting, because we always thought about them like they're going to kill everyone. But actually they kill each other more. They fight each other more than they kill. Other people are just a sideshow for them. In the meantime, while they're conquering the world, but they're fighting the British were always fighting the French and the Russians. In the meantime, we're just conquering the whole world as a sort of sideshow. It's great, it's amazing. So you have this rivalry, between the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Russians. The main fighting and bloodshed is among themselves. And then the 20th century is the greatest manifestation of this. Because you have the two world wars. These are now these people completely surging against each other, in an immense and very extreme fashion. Germany and then the Allies and the Axis or whatever, a massive clash. Never seen before in history, this level of slaughter and bloodshed. It's completely new because now it's industrial. Now it's post-industrial revolution. You've got machinery. So we're now killing with machines for the first time in human history. We're killing with machines and bombs and aeroplanes and tanks. So remember, the Rus are also descendants of the Vikings. The Rus are descendants of the Vikings. So they're part of this Gog and Magog civilization, and that's where I differ with Sheikh Ridhwan Hussain, who has a different theory about the Russians. It doesn't have to. In fact, at one time he did believe the Russians were part of Gog and Magog, but later he's changed. Interestingly, some of the earliest accounts of the Vikings in European writing indicate that there were two types of these Vikings. Two distinct types. You read this in the descriptions. One was a tall blonde type, and one was a shorter brown-haired type. So you had the blonde-haired and the brown-haired, the early Vikings that were coming into Europe. So once again, I'm not sure, but maybe there's something there going back to Yajuj wa Majuj. Why are they called Yajuj and Majuj? I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what's the meaning of Yajuj and Majuj in the dictionaries, Arabic, all that stuff. It seems that it's actually a non-Arabic word. Because even the Quran, even the Arabic language contains words that come from other languages. So a classic example is Firdaus. Many of you may think Firdaus is actually an Arabic word. It's not, it's actually a Persian word for paradise. But it's in the Quran, Jannatul Firdaus. So the Arabic, and this is the nature of any languages can borrow words from other languages. So I think Yajuj wa Majuj is an example where these words have come from non-Arabic. And remember, Arabic there's no G, unless you're from Egypt. There's no G. So Egyptians, they pronounce Ja, G. Often the Ja will become G. Gamil, Gamal, Jamal, Abdul Nasir Gamal. Right? So Yajuj, Majuj, Gog, Magog. Does that make sense? If you look at the Old Norse language, just have a look at the language. It's full of ads and ogs. It's full of words that have got ads and ogs. once again an interesting. Was it that another coincidence? You know, I couldn't find the word Gog Magog, but a lot of the sound of different different sounds. A lot of the old Norse is a lot of Have a look at
it. ما لي سواه عوني وحسبي ما لي سواه غذيتني في الحشا جنينا غذيتني